In this news roundup for the week on 18th of March 2022, President Zelensky does a virtual world tour as geopolitics wins in the war of Ukraine. Vladimir Putin's TV address this week gave clues to changes in the Russian war position, and a British hospital denied reality for a year rather than admit that it allowed a patient to be raped by a man who claimed to be trans. My name is Mallen Baker. This is the Mallen Baker Show. President Zelensky gave speeches to the US Congress plus the Canadian and the German parliaments this week. Like a supercharged Greta Thunberg with stubble, he was greeted with ecstatic acclaim while telling them that they weren't doing enough. Which is the only way those two are alike, obviously, but I couldn't resist the comparison. Once again, after showing a truly stirring video contrasting Ukraine before the war and now during it, he concluded with a call for a no-fly zone. And once again, his audience responded with yay, but no. A few people moaned that he kept asking for things that they considered to be impossible. But as others pointed out, it is kind of his duty to ask, given that his people are dying. President Biden did soon after Zelensky's speech unveil an additional $800 million of US military assistance, including anti-aircraft defences, drones and more, both weapons that are proven to have significant value in the type of conflict we're currently seeing. That's additional to the $13.6 billion in humanitarian and military aid approved by Congress last week. Biden additionally made headlines with just a word when he was asked whether Putin was or was not a war criminal. And after a bit of confusion about what he'd actually been asked, he came back with the answer yes. This seemed to upset the Kremlin more than the vote to give weapons to help Ukrainians fight off their troops. Putin's spokesman Dmitry Peskov said, "We consider unacceptable and unforgivable such rhetoric of the head of state whose bombs killed hundreds of thousands of people around the world." Biden's press secretary Jen Psaki said that Biden's assessment had come from the heart and he was speaking from what he's seen on television. Mind you, you need to be careful of what you believe from what you see on television these days. In a sign of things to come, a deep-faked video emerged purporting to be President Zelensky urging his country's troops to surrender. Deepfake videos are where advanced software can project someone's likeness onto a video, have someone speaking words that they never said, amongst other things. This was dropped onto a hacked Ukrainian news website, part of the ongoing info wars between the two sides. Fortunately, this particular deepfake isn't the clearest or the most convincing example of the state of the art. There were numerous telltale signs of the fakery. It was good enough that an undiscriminating audience made it go viral on Facebook. But it serves as the first example of such videos of political leaders made in order to deceive by enemy nations or opposing political leaders. The second one followed shortly after, this time one of Vladimir Putin declaring victory. That one seems to be more recreational since it doesn't serve a serious misinformation purpose, but even so. You'd have to think that given the state of our public discourse, it will soon become commonplace for videos of political leaders saying incriminating things to be spread by those who want to believe them. And I dare say before long, leaders who actually did say a thing that they shouldn't have done will be claiming that the evidence was actually deep-faked and they never said it at all. Something to look forward to. One of the things to understand about any one event, even as significant a one as the war in Ukraine, doesn't happen in isolation. The broader geopolitical picture always influences what is being done by the various players, so a confounding factor in this case is Iran and what different groups want in relation to the Iran nuclear deal. Specifically, the Biden administration wants to revive the nuclear deal that his predecessor, President Trump, pulled out of. Because that would mean that sanctions could be lifted on Tehran in return for curbs on its nuclear weapons program, and that would bring Iranian oil back onto the market, which would be most helpful for the US and the West in light of the sanctions on Russia. And of course, it accuses Russia of blocking that outcome with its demand to be allowed to have a full trading relationship with Iran, which of course would be helpful to Russia in easing the impact of Western sanctions. The US would also like Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates to increase their oil production. Saudi Arabia is not, however, returning Biden's calls after he labelled them as a pariah following the state killing of the journalist Jamal Khashoggi. France, Germany and the UK have been supporters of the Iran nuclear deal throughout and tried to hold it together even when Trump pulled out. They have likewise accused Moscow of trying to exploit the negotiations to their advantage. UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson is the one with the best ties to leaders in Saudi Arabia, a fact for which he's criticised at home, of course, but his trip to the country this week to seek to persuade them to take action seems to have failed, at least at the time of shooting this video. Russia has denied that it's trying to block the efforts to revive the Iran nuclear deal, but then they also say that they haven't invaded Ukraine, so, maybe they are, maybe they aren't. It is definitely using its closeness to Iran as a lever to seek to continue business with the country in exchange for helping the West to gain its objectives. Iran, meanwhile, of course, is keen to get sanctions lifted. Critics have suggested that the original nuclear deal gave Iran what it wanted and merely slowed down its progress towards nuclear weapons. The news this week of the release of the British citizens Nazanin Zaghari-Ratcliffe and Anousheh Ashouri in return for payment by the UK of a £400 million debt can be seen as part of this process. Meanwhile, it's not obvious that Saudi Arabia sees itself as being interested in helping the West out of its Russia-shaped hole. The Saudis, the United Arab Emirates and Israel all believe that if the Iran nuclear deal is revived, Iran will have funding to step up its support for terrorism and violence in the Middle East. Meanwhile, today Joe Biden was due to talk with Chinese Premier Xi Jinping to seek to dissuade him from pulling Vladimir Putin's fat out of the fire by giving him military support. It's not entirely clear that announcing that in advance was the smart diplomatic move. While Xi has been cautious to support Putin so far, there had been some suggestions of movement on that front, of course, for sure. But the thing we do know is that he definitely would not respond to a public demand from the US, especially one that comes with darkly muttered claims of non-specific consequences. And to underline the point, China sent an aircraft carrier through the Taiwan Strait today, just hours before the scheduled call between the leaders. If Putin's war on Ukraine has failed, so far at least, to expose the enfeeblement of the West in the way that China might have hoped, China will surely nonetheless want to make the point that its forces are not to be confused with the ineffective, badly equipped ones of the Russian military. A point that should not be dismissed too lightly, you would think. And how are things actually going on down behind the walls of the Kremlin, given the circumstances of the last couple of weeks? Well, there's actually been some quite interesting potential insights on changes that are going on there. Lawrence Scott Sheets, the president of Eurasian International Analytics, wrote for the Politico website and said this: "In the Soviet period, watching the evening news broadcast on state television provided important clues into what was happening inside the Kremlin. One of my first jobs as a young Russian speaker living in Moscow was monitoring those broadcasts for American journalists." And so, of course, he's been doing the same now, and he thought he detected a notable shift amongst the somewhat confusing signals. Particularly, Putin delivered a 30-minute address on Wednesday this week, and Sheets made 7 observations. 1, a lack of cohesion in the language. At the beginning of the invasion, the airwaves were full of predictions of the inevitable Russian victory over fascist or Nazi Ukraine. But now the term Nazis is being used less in favour of neo-nationalists, and less mention as well of the idea that Ukraine is not a real nation, suggesting that Putin may be dialling back his demonisation on the other side. You don't do deals with Nazis after all, but you might with neo-nationalists. 2, Putin's top advisors have vanished. Most nights, he said, Putin was shown conferring with his tight-knit group, but not since Tuesday. Defence Minister Sergei Shoigu, often highly prominent on TV, has not been seen for days, and he pondered if this was a prelude to some of that group being set up as scapegoats. 3. The West focused on the first half of Putin's Wednesday address, which was particularly belligerent, talking about the self-purification of Russian society in which the scum and the traitors would be spat out like a fly. But the second half was about Russia's economy, the support for families and businesses, and this shows how much of a headache the sanctions are causing and how worried Putin is about those consequences. 4. Russia is claiming that Ukrainians inflicted the worst damage on themselves, because obviously that makes perfect sense. Bombing maternity hospitals, bombing the drama theatre that had children sheltering inside, well, obviously that's the Ukrainian neo-Nazis. There is some recognition that these acts would not be supported or well received by the domestic audience, which is something. 5. Putin is still laying the groundwork for the use of chemical or biological weapons. There has been increasing emphasis on this in recent days, arguing that the West was using Russia to make and stockpile such weapons. Sheets and many Western analysts believe this may well be the Russian playbook that we've seen before of accusing the other side of what you're intending to do yourself. I would add that it could equally be defensively underlining justification for the war that is now seeing many young Russian soldiers coming back in body bags, while also possibly playing to some of the enthusiastic consumers of disinformation in the West who have grasped and amplified the bioweapons thing. And 6, Putin is shifting the goalposts in a way that makes an end play more visible. The rhetoric has moved away from Kiev and the central government. Now Putin claims it was never the intention to capture Kiev, even though he said the exact opposite earlier in the invasion. Instead, there's been renewed emphasis on the Donbass region and protecting the annexed status of Crimea, which is very interesting because previously the latter of those was a presumed done deal and not really mentioned at all. He several times mentioned the importance of neutrality for Ukraine. Now, an optimist would say this was about preparing the ground so that a significant compromise can nevertheless be presented as a victory to his own people. Early days, not to be ignored. And then finally, Sheets adds that the Wednesday performance stoked the impression that Putin really isn't very well. About 20 minutes into his speech, he said that his language deteriorated into a ramble. And he said this: he searched for words, repeating a term roughly similar to, you know. It then became a diatribe punctuated with uneasy pauses, even poor use of Russian, full of unnecessary conjunctions and jargon. The clip of Putin's speech that was posted later on YouTube edited out this section of the broadcast. Today, it's worth noting that Putin was addressing tens of thousands of Russians gathered to celebrate the annexation of Crimea. And there was a puzzling conclusion when Russian state TV cut away from his speech mid-sentence and started playing a patriotic song. This was described as a technical failure on the server by the Kremlin. But it's another odd thing. The upshot of all of this is that while it could still play out horribly, there does seem to be a shifting of tone that indicates real change. Doesn't mean that one should imagine that any negotiation is going to be easy. Ukraine, in fighting the Russians almost to a standstill and absorbing their attacks without their resolve cracking, it has certainly earned them a more even shot at a settlement. But as Bob Seeley pointed out in the UK's Daily Telegraph, history shows that the Kremlin treats ceasefires and negotiations as part of the conflict, not as something separate from it. And he said this: it is highly skilled at hostile negotiations based on the use of aggression and power. In the Russian original, the Kremlin school of negotiation often has the word zhestky, harsh or forceful, attached to it. It is a theory of negotiation based around manipulation, self-deprecation, flattery, uncertainty and threat. They're as likely to seek to spread the impression that Ukraine's leaders are selling the country out so to demoralise their troops and turn the battle in their favour as they are to negotiate in any kind of good faith, he says. The Kremlin will undoubtedly use any pause in fighting to rotate forces, bring in tens of thousands of mercenaries currently being recruited, and to resupply. If the Kremlin thinks it can get more, it'll suddenly make additional demands, feigning outrage based on some invented pretext, and reignite a new phase of the campaign that it was planning all along. Now, all of that may be true, except that it describes a more deliberate and competent approach to the conflict than we've really been seeing so far. If Russia's negotiators know that Putin made a disastrous mistake and this is about damage control, prolonging the conflict in order to obtain that little extra element of advantage at the end may not be seen as the rational course. In any case, Seeley's conclusion is almost certainly right. The West should continue to arm Ukraine, and Ukrainians should continue to presume the war continues right up to the end, regardless of how the negotiations seem to be going up until the point the agreement is finally signed. Wishful thinking that it's all soon going to be over might well be one of the most powerful weapons against Ukraine in the last stages of the conflict. Especially when you add into the mix the apparent ongoing purge of top officials. Yesterday it was reported that a senior Russian security official had been added to the list of those arrested recently. This one, General Roman Gavrilov, was reportedly taken into custody on charges of espionage, amongst others. He is added to the two that I mentioned on Wednesday, the head and the deputy head of the FSB's Foreign Intelligence Branch. Meanwhile, in addition to the regular bombardment of civilians, it's worth also noting the current predicament of the technicians who are trying to keep the lid on the Chernobyl former nuclear power plant. According to the Wall Street Journal, 100 exhausted technicians are working there in abysmal conditions under Russian armed guard, trying to keep the plant safe. They are tired, they are poorly fed, they're being held captive on site, unable to change clothes or shower, sleeping on the floor. A Chernobyl engineer has said that a pool where spent fuel is stocked is overpacked by 40%. Backup pools that should be empty, they too are filled with spent fuel. And therefore the chances of a disaster are suggested to be unacceptably high, largely because the Russian guards simply don't know what's going on. And he said this: in nuclear safety, you always try to forecast the worst scenario and avoid it. Right now, they are trying to hide it, like the USSR did in 1986. Hiding things isn't so easy in the modern age, of course, not least when people of courage make a stand. According to The Intercept, 10 Russian biologists, including some who remain in Russia, so doing this at considerable personal risk, have said that the Russian government is lying about biological weapons being developed in Ukrainian labs funded by the US. As I discussed on this channel last Friday, the biologists confirmed that the biolabs in Ukraine actually deal with pathogens for public health research, not for bioweapons. Their comprehensive review of the documents put forward as supposed evidence by the Kremlin confirmed that normal practices were being taken completely out of context. So, one of the biologists, Eugene Lewitin, wrote an open letter posted on Facebook and change.org, and he said this: the list of destroyed strains published by RIA Novosti and other Russian media outlets contains not a single particularly dangerous strain. The list contains only strains common to microbiological and even more so to epidemiological laboratories. He also attacked what he described as absolutely wild claims that the military had tacked into the narrative, unsupported by any documents whatsoever. that somehow the special DNA of the Slavs could be used to target ethnic Russians specifically with a bioweapon. This was nonsense, he said, that rather echoed German Nazi propaganda. Now, a few short headlines of other news this week. The UK government presented the text of its new online harms bill yesterday. Defenders of free speech attacked the fact that it retains the concept of requiring social media giants to remove posts that are considered to be legal but harmful. The Free Speech Union said that such a measure would give the permanently offended almost unlimited power to silence dissenting views. And even if today's ministers would not interpret those definitions in such a way, you have to consider what the rather more woke elements of, for instance, the Labour Party would make of it at a point in the future if they re-entered government, which you have to imagine is going to happen at some point. And it turns out that definitions matter, as Baroness Nicholson pointed out to the House of Lords this week when observing that for a whole year, a hospital denied that a woman on one of their wards had been raped. It couldn't have happened, they said, because there was no male in the hospital and therefore the rape could not have happened. The definition of a rape, in legal terms, being that it has to be committed by a man. And you can see the horrible punchline coming on this one. Her alleged attacker was indeed male, but officially a trans woman. So in the fantasy world version of definitions, not a man, even though functionally, a man. Only because there was CCTV and other people around was the hospital eventually forced to agree that, well, yes, there'd been a sort of male around and yes, this rape had happened. This after the unfortunate woman concerned, having been gaslit for a year with this ridiculous denial of the reality of what had happened to her, had reportedly been pushed to the edge of a nervous breakdown. If you want to know why the discussion around this issue is such an angry one, and why it's not going to go away, it's because of instances like this. Not because there was a bad person who claims to be trans. Bad people exist in every community. And I say claims to be trans, by the way. Let's agree right now. No one who commits rape gets to define how they get viewed and treated from that point forward. But anyway, no, not that because there was a bad person, but that institutions respond to the situation with spineless, reality-twisting denials of fact. That is hugely more culpable given their supposed duty of care. In the US, the Biden administration is being accused of making a hash of its attempt to strengthen its cyber defences to defend its critical infrastructure from foreign hackers. You'll recall that an attack on the Colonial Pipeline last year led to gasoline shortages across the East Coast, underlining just how vulnerable the system could be. Oil and gas pipeline operators say that the TSA's new cyber regulations are unwieldy, baffling, and more likely to jeopardise pipeline safety than to support it. According to Politico, many of the new rules are focused on personal computers, not pipeline control systems, leaving companies unsure how to comply with them. Other measures could require months or even years of painstaking upgrades that could interrupt pipeline operations. Robert M. Lee, the chief executive of cybersecurity firm Dragos, said, "In every sense, TSA has screwed this up," and he called it a perfect example of what not to do with a regulatory process. Which would all be fine if we thought that Russian hackers would accommodate by being as incompetent as the Russian military conscripts. I'm guessing probably not. On Wednesday, I commented on the bravery of a woman who held up an anti-war banner in the background of Russian state TV. When you see something like that, you do wonder if the situation was the same for us. Would you do the same? I mean, the vast majority don't. If you look at Russia now, even though the history and the culture of the place is different, you'd still see the same groups you would see here or in the US. A minority of people who stand against the tyranny bravely. A majority who hate it but stay silent or who simply flee for other places. And then another minority enthusiastically engaging in it, who could never hold sway if it wasn't for that silent majority in the middle. We all like to think that we would be in the brave group, As Jordan Peterson is fond of pointing out to audiences, given the percentage of Germans who actually did that in the Second World War, the chances you'd actually be in that group statistically are vanishingly small. And we had some confirmation of that this week. A poll in America asked citizens whether, like the Ukrainian men, mostly men, along with some courageous women, would they stay and fight or would they flee? America, the land of the brave and the free. What a question to ask. Well, you can probably see where this is going. 7% gave probably the most honest answer, which is don't know. 52% of self-identified Democrats predicted that they would run. They would be joined by 25% of Republicans, a veritable stampede of the not-so-free, the not-so-brave. Republicans may at least be taking satisfaction from the better numbers on their side, and you would intuitively presume that their side would have more patriotic types prepared to put their life on the line for the flag, but you never know. Because one thing we can take as read is that a significant percentage of those saying they would stay and fight are possibly kidding themselves. We have no way of knowing how that would play out in reality. But still, a sobering result, I would suggest. I have no idea what the equivalent figure would be for Brits. I have no reason to think it would be much different. It comes down to how comfortable and risk-averse your population has become. The point is, don't know is the right answer for most of us. We really don't know how we're going to rise to it until we're tested. Because, you can surprise yourself pleasantly as well as the opposite. And the truth is as well that rarely does the really hard choice present itself without you having at least lived with the possibility for some time already that it might do so. You're more likely to rise to a situation that you thought about and prepared yourself for. The other side, though, is that courage is like a muscle. If you exercise it regularly, it gets stronger. You never call upon it, ever, well, it atrophies. There are lots of times when, in the modern age, we get called upon to decide what risks we're going to take. Some of them, compared to what's happening in Ukraine, would seem rather trivial. Questioning an orthodoxy, expressing an opinion about biological sex or trans athletes or whatever it might be. There are many who would find it a risk too far. Now, we're not likely to be invaded tomorrow. We are in a world where our fortunes will hinge on our ability to show courage and clear thinking when the time comes. If we want to meet that challenge, we have to find ways, small ways though they may be to begin with, to begin to exercise those courage muscles in a way that honours those people who are doing it really in fear of their lives today. Don't claim to be inspired by them and then change nothing about yourself. At least we could resolve to do that one thing per day that scares us, makes us uncomfortable at least. Better preparation for the day when you would be properly tested. The arrival for which you can never entirely predict. All right, my thanks as always to the good people who support this channel on Patreon. As you know, without your support, I simply could not put the time in that I do into making these videos, and nor could I seek to cover all of the different topics, regardless of how controversial they may or they may not be. If you would like to join that important group of people, if you would like to add your support to the independent, fact-focused and non-ideological content that I aim to produce here, please head on over to patreon.com/Mallen Baker. It is always appreciated. Either way, have a great week. My name's Mallen Baker. This is the Mallen Baker Show. Thanks for watching this video. If you liked it, please share with anyone else you think would also enjoy it. Word of mouth is really important to us. And if you've not subscribed yet, what are you waiting for? As the saying goes, that subscribe button won't smash itself.